Shana Francesca often struggled with thoughts of self-doubt and feelings of being unworthy or unlovable. This led to suicidal thoughts, body dysmorphia, anorexia, bulimia, and other harmful practices. But that was then. Today, Shana is here to share her story and how we can live more joyful and connected lives than we ever thought possible.
Have you ever felt like giving up, quitting, throwing in the towel? Welcome to Never Ever Give Up Hope featuring Carol Graham. She's an author, health coach, and motivational speaker. Backed into a corner multiple times in her life, Carol shares with you stories on how she overcame some of the toughest obstacles a person can go through in life, but refused to give up hope. Rather than admit defeat, an opportunity was presented, and it involves each and every one of you. Carol will feature spectacular guests who will share their messages of hope, encouragement, and their inspiration to prove why life's adversities only make you stronger. And now, welcoming the host of the show, here's Carol Graham.
Shana Francesca is a speaker, a writer, and an entrepreneur. Shana has been interviewed on more than 60 podcasts worldwide. She has been published in Medium, Authority Magazine, Shoutout LA, and Emotional Intelligence Magazine. She helps people live more, I love this, she helps people live more joyful and connected lives through the principles of life design. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Carol. I really appreciate it.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing your story on Never Ever Give Up Hope, because that certainly you have met the criteria for someone who has struggled and never gave up. So start with sharing your story.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so my name is Shana Francesca. I'm a scholar of intentional and ethical leadership and living and a life designer. And, I started out in this world born into an abusive household and then raised inside of an evangelical Christian cult. So my life, both inside my home and outside of my home, because I also went to the school connected to the church / cult. My entire life was encompassed in not being able to show up as myself and having to align myself with other people's expectations in order to be safe. When I was myself, I was typically punished. And that creates really harmful psychological effects. And, to know that you are not safe to be yourself. And also what kind of compounds that and builds on top of that is that people resent you for wanting to be yourself, for having these moments where you do show up as yourself. And then also being praised for showing up in a way that's inauthentic is also really, really, and we know there's studies that show how damaging that is psychologically when we pretend to be something we are not and then we're praised for it. Right. And so there was all of these things going on at the same time: physical, emotional violence, and eventually sexual violence towards me, in my own household. And then this adherence to purity culture, which we know leads to pedophilia, the glorification of purity and innocence, it leads directly to pedophilia. And then also this over-reliance on, this reliance on child labor, and, for the financial benefit of the church and the school, so there was all of these things going on at the same time. And so I got to see from a very early age what intentionally harmful and unethical leadership looks like. And so it's no wonder that I have throughout my life always come back to and been grounded in this idea of what is it to be able to show up as ourselves? How do we craft physical environments that reflect who we are and allow us to take up space beautifully and intentionally? And then how do we craft our lives and our leadership in ways that are ethical and intentional? And what's the foundational concept that drives those things, that drives our authenticity, and not just ours, but empowers the world around us to be able to show up as intentional. And so, from an early age, my mentors became books. I didn't, when your parents are deeply unhealthy people, they have a tendency to surround themselves with other deeply unhealthy people. And so I didn't have access to anybody whose life I wanted except through books, right? Because I wasn't allowed, what I read, what I saw, what I watched on TV, it was all very controlled. But the funny thing is that somehow I don't know why. I don't know why, but somehow my father didn't see books as quite the threat as they were. And maybe it's because I kind of hid, I learned to hide some of my thoughts and beliefs, right? And to keep those to myself because I knew they weren't safe in the world. But I started reading C.S. Lewis's nonfiction books. I've actually only read one of his fiction and not The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But I've read almost everything he wrote nonfiction, and much of it multiple times, and tried to start to understand the world from a healthy place. And then I started reading like books like Jane Austen and I mean books by, and so you're starting to see and all like just so many books that were like and by authors who were critiquing our society, right? But if you didn't know any better, you would think they were in praise of it, or it was just fiction, right? Like you wouldn't see it as harm, you wouldn't see it as being all that revolutionary. But when you're in an unhealthy environment and you're starting to reach for how are other people able to show up in the world? What do other people think of this world? What do other people think about what's going on in the world? What do other people think about what I'm thinking about? Do they think about what I'm thinking about? And I definitely see the connection between people who are trying to ban books right now and the rhetoric that they're using and the misinformation that they're perpetuating in order to fearmonger.
Right.
Because a lot of people don't know, you can go to the librarian at your child's school, at your local library, and you can tell the librarian, I don't want my child to read books about this, that, or the other. Or if they do, I want to be notified so that I can read this book along with my child and they can ask me questions about it. Or you can just forbid them from reading them entirely. And the librarian will usher your child away from, they will not be allowed to check those books out, right? And so when people are talking about banning books, we have to be paying attention, because they're not banning them to protect anyone. They're banning them to keep those ideas out of circulation. It's because there's plenty of ways that you can protect your own child without making decisions for other people.
Right.
And so, I knew that early on, mentors became, books that I was reading, and eventually led me to recognize that I find so much beauty and so much that's so fascinating about the way that people see the world, the way they have experienced the world, and the way that they understand it and how it has molded and shaped the way that I'm able to show up in the world.
Backing up a little bit, how did you avoid becoming bitter?
Who says I didn't?
Okay, all right. So did you work through that, or?
For sure.
Because there's going to be people that are in that same position. So I'm just go ahead.
Bitterness was absolutely a place I stayed for a really long time. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with it. I think it's a natural part of recognizing you live in a world that is deeply inhumane, right? Like there's so many things that are working against your average everyday person, that there's so many things working against marginalized people with marginalized identities. And so bitterness is going to come up. The thing is, we can't stay in it, right?
Exactly.
We can't stay in it. And because it's disempowering. That bitterness is taking all of your energy and focusing on the person who harmed you or the systems or the organizations that have harmed you, and it steals your voice. And the outgrowth of that bitterness became self-harm, right? And just trigger warning for anyone who's listening who might be sensitive to topics discussing physical violence or sexual assault. I'm going to spend a few moments talking about those things. So fast forward if those are things that you are not in a place mentally to be able to digest at this moment. My father started grooming me from the time that I was 12, or before then, right? But at 12, he forced me to take a chastity pledge in front of our 2,000 person church, 2,500 person church. And the problem with that is that I felt it was a lie. Even though I am no longer invested in the idea of virginity, I think it is a tool, it is a weapon meant to harm people. But the whole concept is like all the way down to the fact that not everyone has a hymen. Like not everyone born with female genitalia is born with a hymen. That's a whole nother discussion. But I was raped at the age of 3.
Oh my word.
And so I knew, standing in front of my church saying, I am pure sexually, that I have not been violated, and I'm going to honor that time. It felt so disingenuous. It felt too vulnerable for me, right? I felt too conflicted about it. And I asked that I just be able to do this ceremony that my father insisted on privately. And he insisted it had to be done publicly. Now, let me also note that I am the only one of my siblings that was required to do it publicly. We later it became clear it's because my father was grooming me and he sexually assaulted me when I was 15. So he was making a public declaration that my body belonged to him. It wasn't about me. It was about him, and him taking ownership to all the other men present that I belonged to him, which is deeply disturbing. So yes, I experienced bitterness for a long time. And also then afterwards, when I asked for help, 3 years later, when I told people what happened, everyone believed me. Everyone
Really?
believed. Yes, because then my father confessed. He admitted it.
Okay.
But nothing was done to protect me. Nothing was done to protect me. My mother did not feel safe to leave him. And for those of you who might condemn her, believe me, I've already been down that road. We've had to work through that for years. The reality is that when an abused person leaves the abusive partner, that is when they are most likely to be murdered. Right?
Oh, you're kidding. Really?
No. And most people don't realize that. So my mother didn't leave for 2 reasons. Number 1, because she knew she was not physically safe to do so. Number 2, because her family, when she had tried to leave him before, had not allowed her to live with them until she could get back on her feet and make sure that she was financially stable enough to be on her own. And then thirdly, she had contacted a lawyer. And because my mother was the primary breadwinner, the lawyer had made it clear that she would have to pay my father alimony. And so there was 3 things working against her. And so she did not leave. And the church did not report it to the police. And then when I talked to a lawyer about reporting it to the police and, having him prosecuted, they made it clear that because there was no physical evidence, there was really nothing that could be done, and nothing would happen. And so I had all of these things stacked against me. So I ended up still living in the house with my father until he left my mom at 24. And I stayed because I knew that my little sister, who's 10 years younger than me, looked exactly like me. And if I left her there, then he would go after her next. And I saw the same kind of grooming behavior with him toward her. And so I stayed. So when I say that there was multiple levels of bitterness on my part, number 1, that I was parentified and that I needed to protect my own sibling. Number 2, that my mom couldn't figure out how to leave him. Number 3, that the church actively hid a pedophile. Number 4, that I was left to deal with this virtually on my own, with everybody else going, "We're too busy. We're not going to help you." Right. And so I did end up going to therapy. My mom and I talked about it. She sent me to therapy for 6 months. That's all she could afford at the time because it wasn't covered by health insurance at the time. Well, there was all of these things going on at the same time. But what I'm going to tell you is that for the years that I spent bitter, my whole life was continually consumed by this man and what he had done to me, instead of focusing on my own healing. And I'm specifically saying healing, not forgiveness. Right. And I had to realize that the 2 things are separate and that I don't owe anyone forgiveness. And what I do want for myself was healing, that I needed to accept a lot of things. Number one, that he was never going to take real responsibility for what he did, that someone can love you and also harm you at the same time, and you not needing to spend time with them. So essentially, I had to mourn the loss of my own father.
Right.
Like he was
Right.
dead, because the
Yeah.
idea of him, because who I had thought he was dead, right?
Yeah.
And so yeah, there was lots of bitterness, but ultimately, I by talking, finding my voice and talking about what I had been through, what had been done to me, the lack of support from the people around me, I found so much healing in that, and in finding the people who did support me. And honestly, I'm going to tell you right now, to anybody who's going through really difficult things, your healing cannot happen like your total complete healing, right? Which I don't think is real, right? Like I think it's a journey for the rest of our lives, but you getting to a place of health and wholeness cannot happen on your own. It needs to happen in community. It needs to happen with people around you supporting you. That's where real healing actually happens. That's where we realize and we get the support that we should have had when we were going through the terrible thing. Because if we had had the support going through the terrible
Right.
thing,
Of
it
course.
wouldn't have been so terrible.
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't have harmed us that deeply, because we would have had people to say, hey, oh my gosh, I'm being hurt here. And they'd be like, oh my gosh, let me help you. Let me come in. Let me protect you. Let me get you the resource. Right. So finding community that supports you is deeply necessary for your healing. That's when my healing really was like, oh gosh, there are people who care if something bad happens to me. And there are people who feel empowered to help me when something bad happens to me from the beginning, right? I have that support now. I have empowered people around me. That's where real healing came in for me.
And your mom?
Yeah, so I went no contact or low contact with her for a very long time. I moved out at 25, and I had a lot of things to deal with, and so did she. So did all of us, because my dad left at 20 when I was 24. Thank God. But there was a lot of things we had to, and it took a good, and we finally got to a place where we can actually talk about things in a way
Oh,
that feels
okay.
much healthier.
Yes.
Only in the last 3 years, guys.
Wow.
I'm 39. My father sexually assaulted me when I was 15. My mom knew when I was 18. This is 21 years later,
Hmm.
right? So I'm not saying that 21 years is everyone's healing process, right? Because
Of
I'm also
course. I get it.
the first person in my family to move towards this healing, to invest in my healing in this way, to recognize what that journey would be like and how much was invested in it. So because I did it mostly for the first 10 years entirely on my own, yeah, it's been a really long process. But that's why I say, if you want to shorten your healing process, find your people.
I like that. Find your people.
Find your people.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That was raw, and I appreciate that. I know that the audience will appreciate that. We are going to take a quick 30-second break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about how your childhood motivated you to help others and a few other things, including I would like you to share life design and your group coaching. So we have lots more to talk about, and we'll be right back.
Carol Graham would like to show you the path from misery to miraculous triumph in her fast-paced memoir, Battered Hope. She relates her determination to succeed as someone who experienced one horrendous nightmare after another: gang raped and left for dead, loss of a child, husband falsely imprisoned, and cancer. Nothing could break her tenacity or faith. No matter what you face, heartache, loss, suffering, or injustice, Carol will illustrate how she became a victor the same way you can. The secret is to never, ever give up hope. Order your copy at Amazon or batteredhope.blogspot.com.
Well, thank you for sharing your story, Shana. This has been enlightening and also encouraging in that there are people who are going through similar things or have been through similar experiences like yourself. I know that what you have to share now is going to be a help for them. And so, my first question to you is, how did growing up in this abusive household motivate you to help others? Where was that pivotal point?
Yeah, I think it goes back to whether or not I wanted to spend the rest of my life being bitter or angry, or I wanted make a difference in the world. And it's not like I had to, but I knew that like I couldn't stay broken. I couldn't
Mm,
stay I couldn't stay. And it was that was not living, that was dying. And so I decided that the and maybe this is a weird way to put it, but like the best revenge was finding my voice. The best way for me to move through the world was to actively look for a way to change it, or for me to actively be a part of creating a world where that isn't anybody's reality anymore. And I may not see it in my lifetime, but that doesn't mean I'm not laying the groundwork for it. And um so I actively learned how to share my story, but I had to get to a certain place of healing to be able to share it
mhm,
in a way that
mhm.
really helped people. Because at first, when you share your story, it's trauma dumping.
Of
You,
course.
like you're
Yes.
absolutely just needing to let it all out. Um, and then as I've moved through my healing, and by the way, you don't like heal from 25 years of trauma like in a year.
Right. No kidding.
Um, it takes a lot of years, but there are times along the way where you go, wow, I can actually talk about this and not feel rage anymore. I can talk about this and not want to cry all the time anymore. There's a point at which, like now, when I tell my story, it almost feels like an entirely different person.
Mhm.
Although I'm 100% sure that it's me, that that's my story, right? And I know that it is. It's just, it almost feels like it's someone else's life, like it was an entire lifetime, you know, different and separate from the one I'm in right now. And that's when you know, okay, I'm still emotionally connected to my story.
Mhm.
It's just that I don't embody that story anymore. I realize that I get to write my own story. And when you recognize that what harm others have done to you, that's the story they tried to write for your life. And
Right. Good point.
part of healing is regaining the recognition that you are the author of your story, and that no one else gets to write it, even though they're going to try over and over and over again. And now people don't really try. Not as much as they used to. They don't try as much as they used to. It doesn't mean that I haven't undergone really painful things since then. When you are raised in a traumatizing environment, you when you've been groomed your entire life to default to other people's authority, there are things you're going to have to confront. Like for a long time in my dating life, I was very much in danger for a really long time. I've been kidnapped and raped. I have been, I've been raped many times in my life. Um, uh, Not like an aggravated assault situation, but I was forcibly impregnated. The sex was consensual, the impregnation was not. And when I say forcibly, I mean he removed the prophylactic in order to impregnate me without notifying me. And back then, morning after pills were not a thing, right? So like
Mhm.
there's all kinds of things that have happened to me since then. It's not like my dad left my life and all of a sudden things got cleaned up, right? Like it takes time for you to recognize how much you default to other people, how much you sacrifice yourself, how much you don't listen to your intuition, how much when people violate your boundaries, like that you don't even know what boundaries are. You don't even know how to set them up. You don't even know how to enforce them. You don't know that you're allowed to enforce them. um, there's a whole lot of things that go along with a healing journey that will come along in this pathway. But now that I know my voice, now when someone violates even my boundaries in a tiny way, if I call their attention to it and they do not immediately say, "Oh my gosh, you're right. I'm sorry. I take accountability for that." If that's not their reaction, if immediately they're trying to gaslight me or defend themselves, I'm out. First infraction, right? Like if our first meeting, you're already trying to test my boundaries, I'm out. I'm out. No explanation, no discussion. I'm out because I don't owe you anything. You're testing my boundaries. You mean me harm. And I'm certain of that. And I don't need to prove it. I'm out. Right. And so like you eventually get to a place in your healing journey where your boundaries are really beautiful and they're really amazing, and you can set intentions and expectations in your relationships, and then you can have discussions when those, around the other persons, and there's just like, again, that's where like intentionality comes in, and it's such a beautiful place to be in your life.
I'd like you to share, if you would please, your life design program, your group coaching, and also if you could give any testimonials, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, so I do conduct group coaching. Typically, I try to gather a group of people together for a group coaching, like 4 to 6 weeks, at least once a year of the broader public. But if people reach out and I get enough people, we'll do it all throughout the year. Oftentimes now my group coaching is inside of organizations, inside of either, nonprofits or organizations where we're discussing what it is to be intentional and ethical. But absolutely reach out about that. I am typically connecting with the broader public through my workshops now. I have 2 workshops and I'm adding a third. So I'm a keynote speaker and a workshop facilitator and a consultant. So, I'm always looking for speaking engagements and opportunities to come in and do more workshops. But in order to democratize information, I offer my workshops in an abbreviated version through my website. And also the opportunity for people to hire me as a coach directly. But to recognize and get people started, and each workshop comes with a workbook that it's a 33 page workbook, for people to be able to continue that work on their own. And it's really accessible pricing. The individual workshop, I think both of them are $40 or $45, because I want people to be able to do this work for themselves.
Right, that's very affordable.
It's very affordable. And that gets people started, right? It gets you to have activities. Each workbook, there's activities, there's 5 chapters, there's an activity with each chapter. There's also an accompanying reading list, so that people can dive in and do this work, and start doing this work on their own. So then they can also kind of, and I encourage people to go to therapy, and get this process started for themselves. And then you can come back and let's talk about group coaching and so on and so forth. Because sometimes when you're like, if you're right in the beginning of your healing journey, I can't be people's therapist. And so I really encourage like my workshops along with going to therapy if you're in the beginning. If you're further along in your journey, you can do the workshops, no problem, right? But yeah, so I'm facilitating my work through my keynotes, my workshops, both inside of organizations and through my website, and then also doing some consulting.
In conclusion, would you be able to give a word of encouragement to whoever you would like to speak to in the audience specifically, and also how people can get involved?
Yeah. I absolutely know at the core of my being that curiosity is what saved my life. The desire to because when you're inside of these really harmful, abusive systems, they don't want you to get curious. They don't want you to question the system. And so oftentimes you've been punished for your curiosity. And I also truly believe that a huge part of our healing is tapping back into our curiosity, which also connects to our, it connects to our intuition. And so I would just encourage you to get curious, listen to the stories of the lived experiences of people around you, recognize that there are more people in the world who understand what you've gone through because they've had their own difficulties than you necessarily previously understood. And the important part of that is that you can then form community around people who genuinely care. and are further along in their healing journey than you are. That's also like a key point. It has to be people who are further along in their healing journey than you are, because people who are at the same place, it can be easy to kind of stagnate each other. Unless you're all actively doing your own individual work. But yeah, curiosity. Please invest in it deeply.
That's very good advice. That's excellent advice. Thank you. Thank you so much for being on Never Ever Give Up Hope. I sincerely appreciate you sharing your story and also the tools that you have given the audience as far as their healing journey. And I thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Never Ever Give Up Hope, featuring Carol Graham. Did you know that most people succeed because they are determined to? Quitting was never an option. Carol loves your comments and will respond to each one. So please subscribe and review this podcast. A rating of 5 stars would be outstanding and appreciated. Remember, if you are still here, there is always hope.